Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sports all around the world. My name is Younes Filali, and this is the third episode of our collaboration with the Iranian Women's Sports Law Association. Over the past episodes, we explored athletes' protection through legal, political, and governance perspectives. We examined what happens when athletes withdraw from competition during moments of crisis, the risks they face when speaking out, the role of NGOs and independent actors when institutions fail, and the broader governance gaps that leave many athletes navigating these pressures alone. Across these discussions, one idea repeatedly emerged. Athletes' protection is not only a legal or institutional issue, it's also deeply human. Because behind every governance structure, every disciplinary framework, and every political controversy, there are athletes dealing with fear, pressure, uncertainty, identity conflicts, and emotional consequences that often remain invisible within sports systems. Today's episode shifts the conversation toward that human dimension. What happens psychologically when athletes are forced to choose between performance and conscience? How do political crisis, institutional pressure, and public scrutiny affect their mental well-being? And can sports governance truly claim to be athlete-centered if psychological safety remains secondary to performance, neutrality, and institutional stability? To explore these questions, I am joined today by Andrea Marcela Castaño Rodriguez, sports psychologist, doctoral researcher at Charles University, and member of international research groups working on sports philosophy, ethics, and safeguarding. In this episode, we will examine the psychological impacts of political institutional pressure on athletes, the limits of current safeguarding approaches, and the relationship between mental well-being, ethics, and governance in contemporary sports. Because ultimately, protecting athletes isn't only about rules and regulations. It's also about understanding what these systems do to the people living through them. Let's break it down. Andrea, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Before we dive into the core of the episode, I would like to start from your own perspective. Your work sits at the intersection of sports psychology, ethics, safeguarding, and athlete well-being. What initially drew you to this field, and how has your experience shaped the way you understand the relationship between sports, mental health, and institutional responsibility?
Well, hi, Jonas.
Hi, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me. And for this whole series. It has been very interesting to listen to all the podcasts you have. So my background is applied. I worked directly with athletes in context of performance, injury, identity transitions, and psychological well-being. And in parallel, I've been developing more a theoretical side. So I'm currently doing my PhD in kinanthropology at Charles University in Prague, as you know. And to answer your question, my research sits at the intersection of sport philosophy and psychology, specifically looking at how athletes from marginalized traditions are excluded, not just physically or legally, but epistemically. That means whose knowledge counts and whose doesn't. So this conversation feels very much at the heart of what I'm doing, what I think about every day. So, yeah.
And so in the last episodes, we discussed how athletes who speak out or withdraw from competition are often labeled as problem athletes and can become isolated from teammates, coaches, and institutions. So psychologically, how does this type of institutional isolation affect identity, trust, and long-term well-being?
Imagine you're a professional runner, for example. You train your whole life for this, but you're pretty much aware that if you speak about what's happening in your country, you'll lose your spot on the team. And that's not because you cheated, not because your performance dropped, just because you spoke. So hold that feeling for a second. That internal rupture between who you are and what the system allows you to be has a name in psychology. It's called moral injury. And moral injury isn't burnout, it isn't stress in everyday sense. It's a specific damage that happens when a person is forced to act against their own values. It's a violation of conscience, characterized by deeply guilt, shame, and betrayal. So what makes it so damaging in a sport is that athletic identity is so deeply fused with the sense of self that this isn't just a professional setback. It feels existential. Because for many athletes, the sport is not just what they do, it's who they are. And to make it worse, the institution almost never calls it harm. But the athlete lives it as harm.
So also in the previous episode with Nikki Dryden and Faraz Valley, we explored the legal and governance dimensions of athletes' protection during political crisis. From a sports psychological perspective, what happens internally to athletes when they feel forced to choose between their career and their values? Because as you said, we have a lot of examples where athletes choose to not speak up about what is happening because they fear repercussions in terms of their national team, their national their NOC, the sponsors, the broadcasting companies, and everything.
Think about what a sport gives an athlete beyond medals. It gives them a community, a sense of purpose, a daily structure, and as I said before, the story about who they are. So now imagine that the same world, those same coaches, teammates, administrators, start treating you as a problem, as someone who doesn't belong. That's not just exclusion, that's institutional betrayal. So when the structure you depend on, that gave you your best years to, turns against you, it doesn't just end your career. It can shatter the story you told yourself about your own life. And there is something that makes this worse. When you try to speak about it, if there is a mechanism to do that, that's not always the case. You become this difficult athlete that you mentioned. So your credibility is taken away before you even finish the sentence. There is a philosopher called Miranda Fricker who has a term for this: testimonial injustice. Your words are not heard as valid testimony simply because of who you are or who the institution has decided you are. Problem athlete, for example. And this is not just frustrating, that's a form of harm. So the consequences are what I mentioned before. You have to betray yourself to stay in the institution. That's a contradiction, right? It's beyond frustration.
You have to corrupt yourself in a certain way.
Exactly. You have to be someone different to belong, even when you no longer believe in what you are doing. That's very difficult to manage.
So many governance frameworks speak about safeguarding, but usually in physical or legal terms. Do you think psychological safeguarding is still underestimated in global sports governance, especially during political or social crisis?
Right now, if you ask most sport organizations, do you have a safeguarding policy? They will say yes, absolutely.
And even there are a lot of agencies and sports organizations that don't even have safeguarding frameworks.
Yeah, maybe something about harassment.
Yes.
Bare minimum. Maybe they will show you documents or physical safety, preventing abuse,
Or an
ethical code, something about that. But there is a whole category of psychological harm those documents don't touch. For sure, they don't ask what happens to an athlete's mental health when the rules themselves are the source of the damage, right? So when the selection processes, the code of conduct is producing harm, and there is no mechanism to even name it, what happens there? Most governance frameworks treat psychological well-being as something the individual either has or lacks. If you are struggling, here is a referral to a psychologist, and that's all. If they have access, because sometimes they don't. But the response ignores the institutional contribution to the problem. What I see in current frameworks is a category error. They're built to protect athletes from bad individuals. But what happens when the harm is produced by the institution's own rules? There is no safeguarding mechanism for that. And until governance acknowledge its own role in the psychological harm, the gap will remain.
In previous episodes, we examined how neutrality in sports can sometimes silence athletes rather than protect them. From your perspective in sports ethics and philosophy, is expecting athletes to remain neutral psychologically realistic when they are directly affected by violence, discrimination, or repression?
Yeah, I know you already discussed this with Nikki, right?
Exactly.
But I think it's important to revisit the question, because what does neutrality actually mean in a sport? Usually, as she said, it means don't speak about political events. Just compete and represent. Leave the world outside the stadium. Something like that, right? But here is the thing. Neutral is not actually neutral. If conflict is happening, if violence is happening, staying silent is itself a political act. And I agree with her in that. It is choosing a side, the side that benefits from silence. Think about it this way. We don't ask athletes to be neutral when a sport is used to celebrate national victories, right? We don't ask them to suppress pride when they win a medal for their country. The neutrality rule is selectively applied in that sense, almost always in ways that silence those who are already marginalized or in danger. And from a purely psychological standpoint, demanding that a person suppress their emotional response to something that directly affects their safety, their family, their community, that doesn't make the response disappear. Research on emotional regulation is clear on this. What we force down physiologically amplifies. So the demand for neutrality doesn't protect the athlete at all, right? It just makes the harm invisible for the institution. So the harm is for the athlete and for the institution at the end.
What about athletes who are too big for being cancelled? For example, I have an example in mind. Lately, there was the parade of Barcelona winning the Spanish championship trophy, La Liga.
Yeah.
And in the bus parade, there was Lamine Yamal, the star player of Barcelona, raising a Palestinian flag, which was a huge statement about what is happening now in the region. And still, he did it knowing the consequences of what could happen. There was the Minister of the Defense of Israel that talked about it as something anti-Semitic. And in the same time, we can see that Lamine Yamal, for instance, is too big for facing repercussions, not like other players who talked about political issues, about humanitarian issues, and saw their career blown away. What do we think about like these kind of athletes, these kind of stars, international stars that still choose to speak out, even even if it can be like negative for them in the long term.
So let me paraphrase to see if I understand the question. So the argument is, if you are big enough, you can escape this neutrality role.
This is my question to you.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And how to manage that, how to represent without losing your values. As I said before, neutrality is not possible. Not in this sense. I know what neutrality means in sport organizations. Represent, and that's it. You're here to play, not for making political stands. But this is ambiguous, right? If you're big enough, then you can do whatever you want because you know you can get away with it. And now it's in the individual, the responsibility, right? That's very difficult to manage. What do you want to represent? What you have to decide. And in your example, he's a very young athlete, right?
Yeah, he's still not 19. He's going to be 19.
Exactly. He's defining his own identity. And on top of that, he has to defend his beliefs against an organization. The repercussions could be the ones that you mentioned, but psychologically, that forms your identity, right? Your character, what to defend, when to do it, and temper yourself to do it in the right way. So athletes do not just play, train, and compete. They have to manage expectations. I know that every human being knows how that feels, right? Managing expectations from your family, from your country even. But that requires a huge exercise of your own decisions. You have to define who you are in a very young age and defend it. And that's very difficult to do outside the focus of the entire world. Imagine that you do something and then a ministry responds. So my point here is that we used to see this as a personal thing, but actually is a structure, is an institutional thing. So to answer your question, how to manage that personally requires a lot of effort, psychological effort, manage expectations, social support, and so on and so on. But structurally, if we think about the institution, you need support. And in that one, he was alone. It's him taking the repercussions of his actions. And the institution, away from it, trying to say, oh, it's him as a person doing it, not my athlete, or trying to represent him and trying to protect him. Is that safeguarding? Is that what we are defending? That's the question. So think about it. It's not just the person, it's the institution.
And just off the record, I would like to say that as a Moroccan and as a Barcelona fan, I was really proud of his gesture. So athletes are often expected to perform under extreme emotional pressure while publicly representing their country. How do political conflicts or social crises change the psychological meaning of representation for elite athletes?
Well, always representing your country in elite sport is supposed to be one of the most meaningful moments of an athlete's life, right? And for many, it generally is. But I want you to think about what happens to that meaning when the country you are representing is in the middle of a conflict, or when it is the source of discrimination against people or people like you, for example. The flag doesn't mean the same thing anymore, of course, and you're not just carrying national pride. You might be carrying a symbol that from part of the world watching represents harm.
Yeah, like the example I have in my mind right now is especially in countries where there are a lot of immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the first example that comes to my mind is the French football national team,
Yes.
where you have almost all the players come from immigration, and you can see when there is the national anthem in the stadium, very few are the players who actually like sing the national anthem. And when you ask them like post career, do you feel French or do you feel like more attached to your country of origin? Most of the time they'll, yeah, I chose France, but for sporting reasons. So you also have like this thing, especially when athletes come from immigration or feel like they don't necessarily belong to the ideologies of their country, especially when there is racism, there is homophobia, there is sexism.
Yeah, exactly. So you might be representing a nation that does not fully recognize your humanity or your religion. For example, if we talk about France, identity is deeply relational, you know? You need people around you to form that identity. So when the political reality behind representation becomes contradictory, yes, I'm in France because of sporting reasons, but I'm from other country and I feel attached to this food, to this language, to this other part of the world, but I have to manage the expectations of the French government. Well, that becomes contradictory. And the athlete may lose the coherent sense of purpose that once made competing meaningful. You have to do something.
One recurring theme in this series has been the gap between institutional rhetoric and actual protection. From your experience, what are the psychological consequences when athletes lose trust in the institutions that are supposed to protect them?
There's a specific kind of pain that comes from losing, but from being betrayed by people who were supposed to have your back. Athletes invest everything in their institutions. Years of development, their social world, often their financial stability, and enormous emotional trust in structures that control their future. Every aspect of their lives, even what they eat, that's fully trust, right? So when those structures fail them or actively retaliate against them, the consequences go far deeper than frustration. What I see in clinical practice is that the second injury is often more damaging than the original harm. The athlete speaks up, the complaint goes nowhere, they are told it's confidential, there are not visible consequences for the institution, and that sequence, speak, be ignored, be managed, teach the athlete something very specific. Your experience doesn't count here.
We have spoken a lot about legal protection and governance reform, but less about recovery. After periods of retaliation, exclusion, and forced silence, what kind of psychological support systems are most necessary for athletes to rebuild stability and agency?
Well, to be honest, most of the psychological support available in a sport is designed to get athletes back to performing. Better focus, better sleep, better management of competition anxiety, for example, and everything is useful. I'm not saying it isn't. But when an athlete has experienced institutional harm, retaliation, forced silence, exclusion from their community, well, performance recovery is completely the wrong frame, right? It's something even meaningless.
For this case, I have two examples in my mind. They are not connected to speaking up about something, but more about how the institution is helping you or not. The two analogies I can make are about two DSD athletes. The first one is Casper Semenya, where she didn't necessarily have support from the institutions, And the second example is Iman Khalif, the Algerian boxer in the last Olympics, who won the gold medal. And she still had the support of her NOC and of the Algerian government in that period.
So you can see the contrast here, right? And that's a very nice example, because you can see how it feels when nobody gets your back and when you have an institution who stands up for you. And the thing is, in the first case, what you need is from and for support. You need a genuine peer community. You need some form of acknowledgement from the institution that what happened was wrong, right? That you deserve something better. So it's psychological value to have an institution behind you that supports you fully. What we need is to think about it, how we manage these cases and how to protect the athletes, even from the other institutions that could harm them. To stay in your example, right?
Across this series, we repeatedly return to one central question: who protects athletes when sport becomes political? From your perspective, what would a genuine athlete-centered and psychologically safe sports system actually look like in practice? This is your time to give us your utopia.
Well, for that's a very difficult question, to be honest. So I'm going to ask a question as well as a good psychologist. What does the athlete owe the institution? And what does the institution owe the athlete? Right now, that relationship is asymmetrical. The athlete owes performance, compliance, representation, and implicitly silence or anything that might complicate the institution's image, right? What the institution owes in return is vague, procedural, and easily withdraw. They can be there, and then poof, they vanish. So I think a genuinely athlete-centered system starts by reversing that asymmetry. Structurally, governance frameworks that treat athlete testimony as credible by default, not suspect until proven. Independent psychological support that reports to athletes, not to the institution, and mechanisms that produce actual consequences rather than managed silence, right? Culturally, a fundamental shift is how we define courage in sport. Right now, it's almost exclusively means to perform under pressure. You are doing it even if your mother just died. You are going to represent your country. That's courage. And that's so harmful. A truly safe system will also recognize when an athlete speaks out, when they refuse, when they protect their integrity at personal cost.
It's also dehumanizing. It makes you feel like an asset more than a human yourself.
Exactly. It makes you feel used, not valued. So this psychological dimension of an athlete protection is not separate from the governance dimension. It is the governance dimension. Seen from the perspective of the person the system is supposed to serve and not to conquer.
Finally, since this is called the Sports Governance Podcast, I would like to end with a more conceptual question. Andrea, how would you define the term sports governance today?
Oh my God. Well, sport governance, it's a space. Sport governance is not a set of rules, not a committee. It's a space where a structural change is actually possible. Because a single decision by a governing body One policy, one eligibility rule, one selection criteria can change the entire trajectory of an athlete, for better or for worse. And that athlete usually had no set at the table when that decision was made. So when I think about governance and think about power, who has it, who is affected by it, and who gets to speak inside it.
As we come to the end of this episode, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Athlete protection cannot be reduced to legal frameworks, governance structures, or institutional procedures alone. Throughout this conversation, we explored what happens internally when athletes are forced to navigate the tension between performance, identity, and conscience. We discussed how institutional isolation, retaliation, and enforced silence don't simply create professional consequences, they create psychological harm. A central idea that emerged today is that many of these harms remain invisible within sports systems because they are normalized as part of elite performance culture. Athletes are expected to endure pressure, suppress emotional responses, and continue performing even when the institutions surrounding them become sources of fear, exclusion, or betrayal. We also examined how concepts such as neutrality and safeguarding often operate in limited ways. Neutrality, as Andrea explained, is rarely truly neutral when athletes are directly affected by violence, discrimination, or political conflicts. And safeguarding frameworks frequently focus on individual misconduct while overlooking the psychological harm produced by institutions themselves. Another key insight from this episode is that athlete-centered governance cannot exist if athletes are only valued for performance while their emotional well-being, identity, and moral agency remain secondary. Psychological safety isn't separate from governance. It's governance seen from the perspective of the people the system are supposed to serve. Across this series, we moved from crisis response with Nicky Dryden to institutional responsibility with Faraz Ghali, and finally to the psychological and human dimension of athletes' protection with Andrea Marcela Castaño Rodriguez. Taken together, these conversations point toward the same conclusion. The real test of sports governance isn't how institutions operate during stability, but how they respond when athletes become vulnerable, legally, politically, or even psychologically. Because ultimately, protecting athletes means more than protecting performance. It means protecting the human being behind it. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know in the comments what topics you would like explored. Make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms and LinkedIn if you found this useful. You are listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Younes Filali. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.